Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. The Rolling Stones famously saying that you can't always get what you want, but if you try real hard, you just might find you get what you need. In this week's episode of Horns of a Dilemma, Mackenzie Eaglen, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a widely respected and published defense analyst in Washington, D.C., talks about how is it we know what we need, especially in the world of defense budgeting, where everything is stated as a requirement, and yet all requirements are never met. Eaglen's discussion takes the form of a question and answer session with members of the audience, where she addresses issues ranging from the balance between counterinsurgency and great power competition, dealing with the unexpected lessons learned by needing to transfer advanced technology and weapons to Ukraine and how that reflects on the United States war planning, and how it is to meet the challenges of coming out of a period of 30 years when defense spending was high and yet wasn't focused on innovation and new technology, but rather on replenishing and providing for the ongoing wars in the Middle East. This discussion is insightful and wide-ranging and will give listeners a far better understanding of the challenges and opportunities confronted in the defense budgeting process. This talk was held at the University of Texas, Austin.
I thought I would sort of start out by giving you the lay of the land in Washington and kind of what are the big policy debates. I mean, you can sense and get an idea for what some of those are based on what you see in the press and media and hearings, like, for example, last night, which I missed because I was with the graduate fellows, but, like the China Commission hearings and stuff like that. And then I want to hear what you want to talk about because I talk all day long every day. Paul just saw my inbox. It's a horrifying place because all I do is talk, and we can go in whatever direction you'd like. And I live in this space, kind of helping policymakers in the legislative and executive branch, saying, what do you want the U.S. military to do, and then are you buying it? It's essentially the question that I answer every day. And if not, where are the gaps? Where are the holes? What should you do if you want to do it better or more well or something like that? And so that's kind of my home. And I'm struck by the first hearing of that commission last night. And like I said, I didn't tune in, but it's interesting because it's high profile, it's bipartisan, and it shows, and then I saw a headline this morning about it, and I was just checking the news feed, and it was like, if there's one thing Washington agrees on right now, bipartisan, it's to bash China. And I thought, yep, that's probably that is true. There is a consensus about what is the challenge, the magnitude of it, and who or what it is in the Chinese Communist Party leadership specifically. But then after that, as some of you have already heard, after that is where everyone disagrees in Washington. And so, what do you do about it? Because it's obviously a multifaceted. It's not singularly military. It's obviously different economies, different societies, different ability to mobilize industry, different ideologies and values, but lots of things, different demographics. Right? There's so many different ways that the two nations compete and sometimes cooperate, and of course the economic component of all of it. So consensus on the challenge, but no consensus on what to do about it and how to do it. No consensus on the timeline of activity. I'll come back to the timeline in a moment. No consensus on the relative nature of the risks that you might take if you focus on this challenge and the rest of the world comes at you with reality and so-called gets a vote. And then no consensus on the trade-offs. So if this is the challenge and you want to emphasize it, particularly for one organization, the Defense Department, how do you, if resources are finite, which they are, what are you going to give up or stop doing or not do, et cetera? And so and what's happening, of course, in Eastern Europe has fundamentally changed this conversation as well. So there's a balance right now between the present and the future, like there always is, but the balance is helping Ukraine immediately, not just with military assistance, but with other economic and security assistance, versus bolstering deterrence for Taiwan so that you prevent some outcome, some potential act of war, which could include quarantine, blockades, or invasion. And what you're seeing is, what Ukraine's exposing is, I think, that assumptions in DC, they tend to be a little rosier than the real world. No surprise. I think we can all laugh about that when we're outside of DC. Like I said, reality gets a vote. Conflicts aren't always short, fast, and intense. They can grind on. They can be based on mass and attrition, which is not the way we prefer to fight wars, but sometimes the wars you fight aren't the ones you pick. And there's also a debate about how much or little Ukraine is in our national interests. And you're seeing this increasingly play out in Congress. I'd love to hear from you guys about your thoughts on that. But even the same questions come up about Taiwan as well. Like, would America fight for Taiwan? The president, of course, has said 3 or was it 4 times now that we will defend Taiwan. He was very clear, militarily defend Taiwan. And so I often hear that same question asked. So, if that happens, if the call comes, will Americans understand that that's also, if it is a vital national interest, and why? So that's one of the big questions, and then underneath it are all these other other conversations and debates that are underway. Another one is recruiting and retention. For recruiting and retaining a professional all-volunteer force when America's youth, people your age in many cases in the room, have so many other options. Not only there's always been a qualification challenge, for meeting military standards for America's youth. But the challenge isn't any longer if you can qualify, it's if you're interested. If you take out qualifications and you say who's interested, it's less than 1% of Americans of a certain age. When you need to bring on tens of thousands of new recruits every single year because others are leaving, right? It's by design, it's a model where it's 1 or 2 tours and done. That's 80% of the force. That's how we do it. For better or worse, you need to constantly replenish those, leaving with those coming. And so what we saw last year was really a historic, in modern times anyway, a historic shortfall for the U.S. Army. And they're just sort of the canary in the coal mine because the other services are having their own recruiting or retention challenges. It just depends on which service and what the problems are. And today's retention challenge is tomorrow's recruiting challenge. So if you can't keep people that you thought would stay for those 2 for that second tour that you needed, then you have to recruit 2 more people. And that's unexpected. And so it's interesting. We had the Secretary of the Army at AEI on Monday, and she and I were talking ahead of time. You can read the transcript or watch the video if you have nothing to do tonight. But she and I were talking about recruiting. And I said, is that what's basically filling up half of your calendar and in your inbox? And it sounded, if I had to sum it up, she might disagree, but if I had to sum it up, what I heard from her, it's Ukraine and recruiting. And like that's where she spends most of her day thinking about those problems. And so she's literally on this shoe leather tour de force across America, meeting with superintendents, students, high school students, middle school students, STEM program leaders, all of that, because this isn't a problem that's getting any better. And it's not as if the Army's going to magically make their numbers this year after missing their targets by something like 10% last year. And so there's clear, fear and worry about the changing desires, needs, and interests of young people to support national service and particularly military service. And then, let's see, the last 2 sort of big questions / debates in DC. Washington can plan as best they want for the world as they hope it will be, but like I keep saying, reality gets a vote. And managing uncertainty is really tricky. And in DC, what you see is the tyranny of the inbox, right? I mean, it's just, there's so little time, there's so much to do. So you just kind of tackle, the alligator closest to the boat, so to speak, on a daily basis, and it's just triage. But managing uncertainty is for militarily is a balance of supply and demand. And there is no demand problem, but there is a supply problem. So it's sort of linked to recruiting, but it's also just really just, there's no slack or margin in the force right now. And so what you see is as the as an organization, again, differing by different services and components, but as an organization, you see across the services, particularly capital assets, they're just aging and shrinking. They're getting older, and there aren't enough of them. And so what you see, for example, like Air Force, end of the Cold War, 411 bombers. Air Force today, combat capable, 59. That's not enough bombers to span the globe, like to do everything that they need to do on a daily basis. And we could go down the list. And I was just telling one of you in the hallway, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, this is a good example of the supply-demand mismatch and this constant challenge of managing that in Washington. The Commandant of the Marine Corps told reporters after the earthquake in Turkey and Syria 2 weeks ago, basically, we couldn't help support a key NATO ally. We may not like Turkey, but they are an important NATO ally because they're in NATO, and we want to keep them inside NATO. And he said, we didn't have the ships, quote, end quote. Just don't have the amphibious ships, so we had no Marines in the region, so therefore we couldn't be there to save lives. And of course, they're America's crisis response force. So it gives you a sense of when you have fewer men and machine, you have fewer options, and that's increasingly what DC is confronting. And then lastly is defense and the debt, right? So there is a lot of increased attention. You kind of see this kind of wax and wane every few sessions of Congress, which of course last 2 years each session. Sometimes at some periods there's greater emphasis and attention on the debt and the annual deficit, and other times nobody cares. And so, for example, after the 2008 recession and financial crisis, what you saw 2 years later was the rise of the Tea Party and the butting of heads with then newly elected President Obama. And then it kind of faded away. The Budget Control Act era came upon the federal government, and you didn't hear much more about it. And then the pandemic, and of course, the explosion in federal spending, and now it's of great interest to Washington again. But the debate is over an increasingly shrinking pot of money known as the discretionary spending accounts, which of course, out of which the military is funded. And the House Speaker has some thoughts on what to do or the contours of a deal. And there is not agreement within his caucus. There's not agreement within the House writ large, and there's not agreement between the two chambers. And there's certainly not agreement between the legislative and the executive on what to do about the debt. And so it's one of the biggest issues, and nobody knows how this ends. I hate to tell you that I don't have the answer, although I'll meet with the speaker's guy tomorrow to chat about it. So tune in, I guess, next talk if you want to hear more. But those are the big issues that I see, and many of these are icebergs, right? So like above the waterline, you can see a lot of the challenges, the scope of them, and the chaos, but there's so much more below the waterline that people like me, I'm thinking about every day. So with that, I want to ask, what are you thinking about, and what do you want to talk about? Thanks.
So I'll ask sort of a framework question first, and then I'll steal the very last question to ask it. So one of the things that you mentioned last night, and is always relevant to the things that you work on and study and make recommendations on. But I guess one of your quotes last night was roughly, there's sort of nothing new in DC in terms of how you frame the strategy, right?
Right.
There may be new terminology, and maybe people who haven't been around for 15, 20 years or something like that may think that it's new, but often it's not. And the example that you used last night was a threat, I think it was threat-based budget, right?
Yeah.
Which we might call, also associate with some of the jargon, pacing threat. One of the things that we were doing before, I think at least a couple of iterations of this, was capabilities-based budget or a capabilities-based strategy. I think the expeditionary force was linked to that, right? That we have these capabilities. The Stryker was a material reflection of that, and that we're not going for a particular threat, but a capacity that we can apply anywhere. And then there's sort of the reality-based budget, which might be SecDef Gates, right? Was hey, we're doing this right now.
Yes.
We got to do this right now.
Right.
Right. So,
Right.
So what in are there other sort of ways of framing this thing that you think come up again? And what do you find is the best or most useful? Because all of these you could argue are useful in certain respects, but what do you find is the most useful framework for strategy, budget alignment, et cetera?
Right. So regardless of how they characterize it, it's interesting. It was what UT alum and former researcher of mine, and he had said, like, well, we're moving back to that in the House of Representatives. And I laughed and I said, basically, like, you're so young, you don't remember that this was a thing like 10 years ago. And then we moved off of it, and now we're back to it. And what's funny, though, is the House is, of the mindset of, cutting discretionary spending, including defense spending. And then I saw this morning the Senate Minority Leader say, we're going to be threat informed and we're going to dramatically increase the defense budget. And that's exactly what I said to James. I said, the threat to you and the threat to me, we might see that very differently. And then, like I said, what to do about it. And one person says you can live off the means that you have, and the other says we need a lot more resources. And now they have to figure that out, right? And so that's exactly the heart of the matter, which is you can say it's capabilities or a threat, and then you still have to figure out what to fund and when to fund it, and kind of what you want those inputs to yield in meaningful outputs, right? And how do you want to solve operational challenges? How do you want to deter? How do you want to prevent bad things from happening? Keep the peace, doesn't keep itself. And so at the end, somebody has to make those final choices. And so I'm still chuckling at the threat-based budgeting and the Senate's comments this morning. So, but your bigger question is, I mean, I do think it's, even though I joked that there really isn't much new, like DC is a town of recycled ideas for the most part. But in terms of the strategy, in terms of China first among equals, in terms of the challenge, that's new-ish. Like, it was kind of radical in 2018 to put that out there so prevalently. And of course, last month when America's, watching the balloon transverse the continental United States, it seems now like the obvious choice, but in 2018 it wasn't to say that, right, for the Defense Department to go so far out on the limb in terms of the challenge. And so I should restrain my skepticism a little bit. But as I was telling you, were just out in the hallway with me. But so policymakers can, again, choose to prioritize. But then now that there's this very long and very intense ground war in Eastern Europe, that's going to lock in the Army's requirements for 2 years. The Army can't be the convenient bill payer, which some in DC would like, as we've been chatting about. And the Middle East always finds you, even if you don't want it to. And so you see the spreading thin challenge when you're trying to focus, and then crises after crises come up to deal with it. And so this strategy took, this in the last defense strategy, took risk basically in Europe and the Middle East. And I think we're still trying to do that in the Middle East, but now Europe's back off the table because it needs help. And it's in our economic and best interest for stability and peace on that continent. And so we're all in. And then, right, so now that's another trade-off that didn't yield, the results people wanted. So now somebody else has to make another choice about how to, so if you were going to cut the Army, and now you can't, although the Army unfortunately is shrinking anyway because of the recruiting challenges. But so now what's the next in line down that list? Anyway, it's not a good answer to your question, Paul, but I want to get more at the strategy. Say it again, what I didn't answer.
What do you find is maybe the most useful way to frame these things?
Okay, gotcha. Neither threat nor capabilities. The most useful way to frame it. Okay. I think we went over this a little bit with the graduate students. Rumsfeld, the then Secretary of Defense, said you go to war with the Army you have, and sadly that's true. It's if Ukraine somewhere else pops up tomorrow, it's just whatever you've got is what you employ. And so what I was trying to explain was that, Washington doesn't start with a whiteboard every year when it funds this organization. It inherits what it is and then can then try and turn up or down dials of strategic choices after that. And I see administration after administration come in thinking they can do more than they can in a short amount of time, but it's hard to do that when so much of the money is essentially sequestered or fenced off for must-pay bills. So there's very little trade space in the defense budget to do anything. So the first place I started is like, no whiteboard. And you have basically 8 dials or levers that you can move up or down depending on your strategic preferences. And then you have these 8 choices. And that's everything from, if you want more great power competition, you can dial down mid-tier defense like Iran and North Korea. If you want more counterterror and counterinsurgency, you can dial down great power. Then there's readiness of the force, what we call the sort of the fight tonight versus another time in the future. Then there's the size, just how many people you have doing what. Modernization, how capable, how tech savvy, how new is the stuff and technology and concepts and techniques that they're using. And the last one is dollars. And those are basically your 7 or 8, I can't remember. Those are the dials. So if I had to talk about it, I wouldn't say threat or capabilities based. I would say strategic choices, and they're very limited. And once you make them, so like the commandant, we don't have enough ships. Once you make them, you may permanently be taking, for at least for a long period of time, options off the table. And do you really want to do that if the bluff has to be called, unfortunately? And of course, humanitarian crises, we don't have to respond to them, but we like to do that for a whole variety of reasons. Mass migration of people, the inherent instability and violence that can result when people, are dying and starving and competing for resources. There's a whole host of other reasons, goodwill, of course, for the U.S., but there's a lot of reasons why we do care about humanitarian operations. And so to me, I don't ever want fewer options. I want more options. And so anyway, I would talk about the 8 strategic choices a leader has to affect change. And that would be, I had never really thought about that before. So.
I wanted to pull on one of the threads that I think has been underlying a lot of the discussion so far, which is nexus between domestic and foreign policy. Because you started off the talk discussing, the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with China, noting that it's unusual because it's bipartisan. Of course, that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things like the Ukraine Fatigue Act. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on the degree to which domestic political imperatives are influencing foreign policy strategic choices.
That's a good question. So when I look at the national security strategy, of course, right, that's the White House's foreign policy document. And from that, you get defense policy documents and strategies. And the two are supposed to be aligned, or at least one flows from the other. What I see in the national security strategy, and I mean, in its own words, the emphasis is on domestic renewal. And it's a foreign policy document. So that's very interesting. That's different, at least different in the last 5 years. And so you see that reflected in the defense strategy to some degree, where they talk about where the department is focused on priorities here at home, including pandemic relief and response, which of course they should be, homeland defense, climate resilience, things like that, green energy for the surfaces, biofuels, stuff like that, emissions, carbon emissions, things like that. And so you see it even then within, you see that sort of translated out through government. And Congress, right, so they get the last vote, however. So the department says, we have all these initiatives based on the document. And then Congress, what they have done up until this point is largely agree, but then go add more dollars above that to say, well, we're really concerned that we're not actually deterring Beijing from thinking about taking Taiwan by force. And then if that happens, we're probably going to lose. So here's more money to specifically focus on the Indo-Pacific challenge. This year it's going to change, but your question I think is even bigger than just the dollars, and where Congress is going. Do I see, how does domestic policy influence? Well, for starters, on the debt matter and question. So if you take Social Security, Medicare off the table, which both parties have in D.C., right? You're really talking about the discretionary spending side of the ledger. And that's a small and shrinking pot of money. And that's the pot that funds the 12, basically 12 not 12 federal agencies, but through 12 spending bills, all federal agencies. And that's the area of focus and the balance between those two, which of course comes down to defense versus everyone else, the military versus all of the other agencies, even if they have a security component to their mission. So I see it playing out just in the fact that debt's an issue this year. Like that's part of the domestic politics. The Ukraine fatigue is part of that as well. Those two are linked to me based on what I hear from members of Congress and hearing from their constituents. We can't secure our own border. Why are we spending all this money for Ukraine to secure its, essentially, to keep its border? I guess is a better way to paraphrase that. And I wouldn't have predicted border security, like particularly the U.S. southern border, being part of like defense security debates about friends, partners, and allies, and yet it is. I think I could come up with other examples, just not on the spot. I'll be thinking, while we keep talking, Chris, to give you more examples of how the two overlap and intersect. And what ultimately happens is, when the pie is the pie, as in federal government spending, because really everything comes back down to dollars and cents, at least a lot of things do, it's a zero-sum game. And so what I do see is an emphasis. I see a Washington bias towards more spending on domestic. Insert priority, anything you want. And I don't know that that's going to change anytime soon. The balloon was interesting. Like, I don't know if that sort of changed any minds that like, why is this, balloon here? Why are they spying? Why did we let, there's a lot of questions there in terms of highlighting, I think, for ordinary people who don't care about DC debates, which I totally understand. But absent like a balloon every week, it's easy it's easy to prioritize. Here, I'll sum it up by saying this. I remember we did I had seen polling, recently, a couple years ago. Americans, particularly women, think about priorities in like concentric circles, right? So me, my family, my neighborhood and my community, my state, the country. And that's great. That's exactly how I want everyone to think. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. That means you don't have to worry about life and liberty. You can just focus on the pursuit of happiness, that third aim of our founding documents, until you have to worry about security, right? So it's foreign and defense policy just aren't ever going to be front of mind for Americans unless it has to be. I mean, I get that. But it's Washington's job to, in those periods in between security problems or challenges or crises, to make sure that when they do happen, they're prepared. And that's not really how it works. People want to, defense is funded like a wavelength, crest, trough, repeat forever. And there's no easy button. Whatever money you save, the few dollars you saved here, then when you got to go figure out how to get armor, to Iraq or Afghanistan, or now tanks to Ukraine or whatever it is, you're going to spend twice as much as you would have by just maintaining that, that capability and that sort of force level previously. I don't know. I asked the graduate fellows, I think, I asked them, I can't remember which group, has anyone seen the Netflix movie Sandcastle? I don't normally have time to watch movies, but it was just really interesting because it took you back to 2003 and the start of the Iraq War. And poor Paul has to hear all my stories twice. And I had just forgotten how bad it was in the beginning. Of course, there were two wars, but they were getting ready to leave the green zone in Baghdad for the first time. These are like the first the first several units, literally in country. And this one of the kids, the soldiers, was like, they were like, oh, Joe, come on, we got to go. We're going outside the wire. Here's your body armor plate. And of course, the vest has a front and a back. And he was like, well, where's the other one? And they're like, nope, don't have enough to go around. Hope it's your lucky day. Pick the right side, front or the back. And that's exactly how it was. But so you save those dollars in the 10 years before that, in the 90s, and the peace dividend, and then someone has to live with those consequences later. So I see domestic policy outsized influence on defense and foreign policy right now. And while it's understandable, it gives me a little concern. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, my follow-up then would be, how would you assess the downstream effects? So just as a pure hypothetical, if China moves against Taiwan and China tries to draw, and say, the House GOP won't authorize military force because the Democrats are in the White House, or if China moves against Taiwan in a future Republican administration, Democrats in the House aren't going to vote for authorization of military force. How do you see those downstream effects playing out?
That's a good question. So like I said, all three scenarios, or at least the three primary scenarios, are an act of war: blockade, quarantine, and invasion. And of course, Taiwan's in that gray area of not full treaty ally, but then there's the Taiwan Relations Act. And so it's somewhere in between. Of course, treaty ally, Senate ratified and confirmed, and there's no confusion about whether or not we will come to your defense. Taiwan is somewhere below that, but above, partner and friend. So it's this, and so I don't think anyone knows how that ends if it happens. I think some of it depends on how it starts. Blockade and quarantine are, to me, I asked the secretary this of the Army. I was like, aren't they a whole lot more trickier and complicated legally and politically? And does the Defense Department overemphasize the invasion scenario because that's what we know how to do, or defend against, or deter? But I'm really worried about, blockades and quarantines, where basically China claims, for example, the right to board a Navy ship, because if the lights go out in Taiwan, 23 million people die in a week because all of their food and energy is imported, like 90-something% of it. And so it's that fast, right? Things go south very quickly for a lot of people. And so even if we weren't involved in the military component, we're going to be involved in helping keep these people alive, presumably. And then things get really tricky, like what happens when they board the ship? It's claiming it's our blockade or it's our quarantine, but they have weapons and we have weapons, and then I just don't know. So anyway, this kind of depends on how it starts. And then it also depends on, I think, simultaneity. It's a big issue. What are we dealing with elsewhere in the world that's like a Ukraine that's really complicated and taxing on our force in particular? And then, national interests. So do Americans think microchips are the new oil and foundational to our economy? I'd argue they are 100%. And where does the world get most of their chips? Taiwan, which is why we're trying to spend a lot of money to build them here, or make them here, make more of them here. But if we don't have those factories open and that happens, we also have naked economic interests. And then of course we have values, and we don't like when big guys invade little guys, and we typically stand against that. And the what does the president like to say? Democracies versus autocracies. We tend to care. And so I don't. It's not a good answer. It's a whole lot more questions, but I hope it gets you thinking about the answer.
Thanks for your talk. I find all this interesting as much as it's, I think sort of in the weeds of implementation of, kind of American foreign policy, kind of strategy and so forth. I'm interested in your, kind of desire to maximize options. Because I think, kind of one of the dominant frames of thinking and sort of like the study of U.S. foreign strategy is that the past 20 years have been characterized by the United States having too many options, right? Where we overextended and 2 wars lasted 20 years, right? Because we could, right? And just weren't sort of bound by the constraints of, having to make hard choices. So I guess I'm curious as to what you think, what are some of the options that we might not want to have, right? Or what would be some of the options that we might want to deprioritize? Given the fact that we won't have one of those options, and are there efficiencies that can be found kind of within in the defense budget, international economy, cutting waste and spending,
Sure.
finding new technologies and things like that? Is there a solution externally, right? By encouraging partners and allies to do more to maintain kind of collectively shared options. I guess just I think it was a really fascinating comment, and I think it makes sense from looking. If you're given a pot of money, maximize the options within that. But that sort of thinking, I think, is what led to some of the foreign policy pitfalls of the last.
I am so struck by that characterization. It's not wrong. I hadn't heard that, like, meaning we're so big and powerful and therefore got overextended because we could do that. When I see it as, or had seen it as, more like, the Army after Vietnam said, we're never going to do that again, and basically shed that thinking, concept building, doctrine and capabilities and expertise, language and other things. And then, of course, like I keep saying, reality gets a vote. Quickly found, counterinsurgencies are really, really hard, and nobody is left anymore that kind of does that or has that expertise. And so it's just so funny, like your characterization and my view of it. And like I said, I don't think you're wrong. I think everybody can see it. It's like a prism, right? There's so many ways to look at it. And so, and in the early days, we were really bad at it too, until we got better quickly. I don't know if that's a fair characterization, Paul. But so, not being constrained by those hard choices, I would say, so when I look at those 20 years, just quickly before I get to your awesome questions on efficiencies and external solutions, the hard choices actually were very much present. And what it was can't focus on what Gates called it, next waritis. It's this at the expense of all else. And so what you see, the net result of that, to me, I look across the last 3 decades, and I see the end of the Cold War, the peace dividend, and the end of history, and what, by extension, the procurement holiday for military spending in particular, and then a hollow but necessary buildup for the wars. But most everything we bought is in the ghost fleet and the boneyard and not in service anymore. Had to do it because you have these people in harm's way trying to achieve important objectives, presumably. And now here we are, and we've had 3 decades of not making, I would argue, enough hard choices about balancing the immediate need of the moment, of the present, with the future. And so Ukraine has kind of exposed the munitions cupboard as bare. Well, who thought, we would only need, a month's worth of insert your, missile, bomb, rocket, ammunition capability? Like that's not very smart. That's what we thought. Wars are short, fast, and cheap, and high tech. And Ukraine is the opposite in every sense of that, right? It's long, grinding, messy, bloody, and there's a lot of artillery and old-fashioned things that people thought were not going to be in wars anymore. So that's interesting. It's okay. Let me get to your questions. Efficiencies, yes. Waste, audits, and then external solutions. So tomorrow you can pull up my report, which summarizes the last 2 decades of Pentagon reform and efficiency efforts. Some of them were internal to the department, some were imposed upon them by Congress, and it lists kind of all of them, what they were, what they accomplished. And the net result, I call it, is a lot of defense. Now, some are very meaningful, but a lot of it is defense reform theater. And it's just what you do for good governance of this large organization, and it's what a lot of politicians ask for, demanded in exchange for maintaining budgets. But judge for yourself after you read the report and shoot me a note. Yes, but are there still ever more efficiencies to wring out of the organization? Yes, emphatically yes. And so I don't know if the one who read my LinkedIn, she was in the graduate fellows class. So for example, yes, and what it requires is to rid yourself of the thinking that there's an easy button, right? There's no line item for fraud, waste, and abuse, and if there was, we'd zero it out, obviously, right? And 2, defense reform is the patient work of many years. To identify it, build a coalition, a political usually coalition to want to address it and then to wring it out, figure out what to do about it. And deterrence is the task of now. So you got to balance those two. The urgent task of now, I'd argue. But I have an article out I've got a bunch of work on this, but I list options for policymakers to think about. So what are the efficiencies now? After I walk through the history of efficiencies, and too often efficiencies have just been to kill a weapon system. That's so easy. You look tough, you look smart, and the reporters love it. People think you're bold and interesting, and you haven't really done anything. And the other efficiency we talked about is changing the org chart. I say moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. Washington loves to add new offices and headquarters and organizations and think they've solved the problem. It's way harder to eliminate offices, organizations, and headcount than it is to add them. So so I list efficiencies. For example, I'll give you one. There's $100 billion of intelligence community spending parked in the defense budget that receives no oversight from the Defense Authorization Committee. It's money that nobody can touch. I mean, it's intelligence money, like the Intelligence Committee, presumably. But nobody at the Defense Department has control over. They don't get to look at it. They don't get to change it. And nobody else on the outside, you and me, of course, have any insight into, well, does that all go to the right place? It doesn't get the same level of scrutiny, oversight, and transparency as every other defense dollar. So maybe we should start with re-examining where defense dollars really go. More transparency about what these, like I said, these inputs, these dollars, what they actually buy in terms of outputs. And so the first thing you need is a more honesty about the accounting. Why is there $100 billion in intelligence community spending in the defense budget? And does it need to come off the books or on a separate account or go back to the IC? Because that's a whole different committee of jurisdiction anyway in Congress and a different spending bill, or should be. I mean, they have another spending bill. I guess they get two spending bills in intelligence. And so then, you're sort of focusing the dollars. Then from there, for example, it would be nice to separate capital from operating investments, right? So you're mostly fixed. You can change headcount, but for the most part, people, pay, benefits, compensation. It's a huge pot of money. 50, depending on the year, it's like 56% of the defense budget. You think probably it all buys aircraft carriers, when really it just pays people, it's professionals to come into work and do what they do, civilians in uniform. And so to kind of better explain that to policymakers, like where do the dollars go? And then you can focus on what you like to think about, like emerging technologies. So then you see this big pot of money and then you realize, remember those strategic choices, how few they are. Same thing with the dollars. This much is malleable and fungible and able to be moved around. And then you can make trade-offs within that. So my reform and efficiency is focused on more honesty and transparency, and then taking away structure or rules or regulations, sunsetting laws, ending reporting requirements, helping sort of clarify, if let's just say you endorse the 22 defense strategy and it says China's, the pacing threat. Then I want to know for every, how are you going to free up time, task, attention, and dollars for the force to focus on that? If everybody's doing this other thing every day to, pick your, whatever that other thing is. So I prefer reform that's not additive. I prefer reform now at this point for the Defense Department that is scrubbing the barnacles of bureaucracy. But there's lots of efficiencies. And then lastly, the external solutions like with allies. Yeah, 100%, totally agree. But it's also already reality as it is. I was at Stanford last month at a defense budget conference, which never happens because usually we're just like a panel at a conference. We don't ever get a whole conference. And this subject. And Jim Mattis was there, of course, former Secretary of Defense. And we were all debating everything we're talking about here today. And he had said, because remember, of course, he had been a combatant commander before he was Secretary of Defense, before he was retired and then became Secretary. And, in uniform for 30 some years, probably close to 40. And he said, I've never once in 40 years, give or take 40 years in uniform, I had never once been in a single military operation, named or otherwise, but, something not like training or exercises, that that was pure American. We just don't do anything alone, ever. And so, like, we have to do that. The solutions with our friends and partners and their industrial base, their innovation and technology base, like, we don't have all the answers, and we definitely don't have the excess capacity to solve all the problems anyway alone. So I'd argue there's, outsized effect, force multiplying effects in working with them on solutions. I didn't get to ask you in the car ride on the way over if you thought about AUKUS and looked at it, but we could debate, like, is that like a model for the future, for this kind of doing what you're talking about, not just sort of actual capability of hardware, but technology too. And so you'll have to tell me afterward what you think.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit already, but you mentioned how there's, because the U.S. government can only do so much, there's this tension between what we want to do with Ukraine and what we want to do with Taiwan. I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think is that actually a problem? And if it is, what should we do then?
Well, I'll give you an example of how it's a challenge. So again, munitions, things that blow up. We're sending a lot of it to Ukraine, varying different types. Like I said, missiles, bombs, rockets, ammunition, and more. There's even more types of munitions than that. And we're drawing down, in some cases, our own stocks. We're not just giving them excess things that were in the warehouse, but things that we might actually need should we get involved somewhere else. That is a huge gamble that you hope no one calls that bluff. Now, is our leaders busy trying to replenish the stocks and replace them with kind of newer and better? They're doing both. But what they found is the cupboard was bare. Their assumptions about war fighting are too rosy, meaning one type of one munition, Ukraine expends in a month what we build in 1 year. So you need a whole lot more if war lasts longer than a month, which it's probably going to, right? Or at least you should safely assume that, I think would be a better way to put it. And so the munitions cupboard is bare, and what the administration and Congress even found was, so then they turned to industry and they said, because I focus on things that blow up because it's uniquely a defense product, right? It's not something you can go to Microsoft or Amazon or Google. Like, these are things that you need to be certified by the government, like just the environmental impact, the chemicals when you're working with things that go boom, right? Very specialized facilities, very specialized workforce, might probably have a clearance. You need cooling plants. I mean, just to even produce this stuff is shocking what goes into it. It's a miracle we have anything, actually. So these are unique Defense Department products that they ask for and only certain companies can produce, is what I'm saying. That's why I'm giving you this as the big, long answer. So they turned around to industry and were like, so more Stingers, Javelins, and HIMARS, please. And the president went and visited the factory, I think, that makes Javelins. And the industry was like, we don't have the facilities anymore. Definitely don't have the workforce to like double or triple this quickly. And we certainly don't have a demand signal over the long term that if Ukraine ends tomorrow, you're going to keep buying this. So we're out, basically what they were told. And of course, White House and the administration and Pentagon leaders went back and were like, no, seriously, please. Like, we're going to use multi-year contracts for munitions, which is never happens. We buy ships over several years, meaning Congress will appropriate funds 3 years ahead of time to need, so you can order long lead supplies like certain components and metals. They do that because that's a specialized workforce and you want to keep those suppliers in business. But the reason Congress hates multi-year and the Department of Defense is because you don't want to tie the hands of your future Congress. You've committed money now. You might not even be in office. So that's why nobody does these for anything else. So that gives you a sense of how serious it is when we're doing multi-year purchases over several years for this capability. That means people are really nervous. I mean, it's good that we're doing it, but they're really, really nervous. And so my answer is not a good one. I come back to it, we took a big gamble, and we better hope no one calls not the bluff, because it's not a bluff. We made an overt choice. That was definitely a hard choice. So let's try and make sure bad things don't happen in the meantime.
I've been thinking about historical analogies as you've been talking today. I've been thinking about 1940 period.
Mm-hmm.
I thought about, I was part of the turnaround of the U.S. Army in the late 70s through the 80s, and it was a very focused. We made some hard choices about what we're going to be good at, and it mattered. And that's one of the points I would make just editorially, is that there's efficiencies at this national budgetary level, but then there's also just getting better by trying to get better in particular areas. And so the absence of clarity about what we're supposed to get better at is a big cost.
Yes.
And it's an efficiency in itself.
Sure, here.
But this very specific, much narrower analogy I thought of was the U.S. military, the Army in particular. Well, I know more about the Army, but during the interwar period, they really thought a lot about mobilization.
Yes.
And you were just talking about using allies. So we had this huge industrial base, and we focused on how to mobilize it, how to. And in fact, Lucius Clay and Eisenhower had an assignment where that's what they did. They spent a year or two going around doing that. And they came up with things like, go to the ladies' nylon hose factory and explain, that you'd like to give them a small contract so that they learn how to make parachutes, and then they know how to do that. And I'm just wondering if we shouldn't be having a strategy like that with, you mentioned our allies' industrial base.
Yeah.
And second, how do you convey to Congress or to other people that actually pushing some of that offshore is good? That in other words, there's a desire to build our own industrial base and to be able to manufacture and hold all that here.
Right.
But how do we get intentional about, multi-year contracts with other countries or something like that, so that their industrial base, which is maybe more manufacturing based, what do you think about that?
I do like that. I like it a lot. Yeah, the arsenal of democracy as it was no longer exists, as you can tell. Do I think if needed, the nation would mobilize to some extent voluntarily, like they did in COVID, right? So you see Kentucky, bourbon shops making hand sanitizer, right? And so America's companies stepped up. Like the president had the Defense Production Act in his back pocket, where he can compel somebody to help. And he used it a couple of times, the last president. But what the White House found was they didn't need to. They would go to a company and be like, and everyone was like, no, we got it. We're here to help. We're going to do what you need to do. Ventilators, sanitizer, PPE, whatever. So that gives me hope, and because we're not returning to the arsenal of democracy, so to speak, the term we use of, where Ford turned its auto manufacturing plant, to build aircrafts and chips and things like that. So I have a glimmer of hope from COVID that, that showed that maybe, all hope is not lost if needed. But I worry. I've served on these. In the last decade, there have been 3 national defense strategy commissions, and these are congressionally appointed and stood up, and they're to stress test the Pentagon's work, sort of to grade their homework, but also to sort of just kind of give an independent, nonpartisan or bipartisan, depending on how you look at it, assessment and of how the strategic aims and in the document stand up to reality, I guess is the best way to say it. So I've staffed these a lot, and all 3. And each report, to your first part of your question, each report says no one cares about mobilization and we need to care. And mobilization to me means 2 things: of an industrial base, including technology and software, industrial base, and those who provide services, like KBR or something like that. And then mobilization of manpower, of Americans. If you actually really needed to grow the military overnight, double it in size, nobody wants to talk about that. And I understand why, but the commissions keep urging politicians to study and figure out the answer to these questions. And so I'll leave it there that no one's thinking about it. They don't want to. But on your, question about pushing some of the ability to produce things offshore, yes. It's actually, I'd argue, necessary. Why? Because, when the U.S. Army Pacific commanding general came with the Secretary on Monday to AEI. And then, and I've spent time with other leaders, like the combatant commander in PACOM, for example. But you could see this in Europe, too, with Ukraine. When things start blowing up and, actual, warfare is underway, you're not going to steam your broken ship back to, the shores of America. You need to rapid repair wherever you are. And that's going to be somebody else's port, somebody else's warehouse, probably some localized contracted workforce, I mean, you need, for just logistics and repair alone, we need lots more. We need lots more everywhere. Now, that we're going to give people conspiracy theory, but yeah, I love it. I think we have to.
I'm sorry, I'm still trying to word it properly in my head. I'm interested about the recruitment deficits that are happening. Partly because I'm part of Gen Z, so I see a lot of the social media, especially about like different cultures and fashion, and what my generation is in the military.
Mhm.
So I can kind of understand why the numbers are low in some areas, even if I don't agree with all the opinions. But how do you combat some of those narratives, or how do you encourage recruitment in the first place? Because I totally agree that I think the personnel issue is going to be a really big one, because once all the fancy tech stops working and we just have men on the ground, if we don't have properly trained people, we don't have people that are really dedicated, if we don't have enough people, that's going to be a really big issue. And if we can't recruit them and retain them, what are we going to do? So I don't think are you the person to ask how to encourage recruitment?
Yeah.
You're hired. I need to bring her to AEI. I loved your question. You thought it wasn't properly formulated. I think it was perfect. So quickly though, before I answer it, if you have to make a sweeping generalization, we'll caveat that, of course. What does your generation think about the military or service?
Distrust of larger, long-standing institutions.
Yeah.
And as coming from a South Texas Title I school, seeing the military recruiters in high school felt a lot more predatory than helpful. Sort of like, this is where you have to go because you don't have any other options in society. As opposed to, this is the place where you want to be because it's got good reputation and lots of resources.
Interesting. Yeah, and you see that bear out in the polling, right? Americans beyond your generation, there's no other word other than there's a collapse in trust in the U.S. military as an institution. And I'd say it's been building for about the last 7 or 8 years in particular, but I mean, it of course spans longer, but when retired generals are on presidential campaign stages and in Oval Office, there's so many different reasons why we could argue or talk about why Americans it could be the end of, they're not on the front pages anymore. There's a whole lot of things. But there's real number of polling that bears out exactly, it's not just your generation. So first, we all know the 12-step adage, like first you got to recognize you have a problem. And I think leaders didn't until they didn't make the recruiting targets. But now everyone's like, this is a crisis, because it is. And it's not going to get better magically if we just stick our head in the sand. Thank you. That's great. In Washington, that's not always what we do when reality confronts you in the face. And so combating the narratives, right? I mean, so I've talked to a lot of senior leaders about that question. And, there's no substitute for exposure to someone who has that job telling you they love it. There's just no substitute for that. So you need exposure to people in the armed forces. But that's also really hard to come by because we're in a post 9/11, behind all the fortified walls military. Like America has less and less and less daily contact with people in uniform. And when you don't have contact with them, it's really easy to not care or be overtly hostile to who they are, what they're doing. It used to be like, I remember back before 9/11, I'm not that old, but I can remember back those days, but like a lot of military bases and posts and installations, they would have community days and you could just drive on, talk to the commander, be like, oh, we're starting this, we're going to open a new fire department. I see you have a fire department. Why don't we offset each other so you don't need extra trucks and we can work together and yeah, great. And they would have, whatever, things that entertained children and they would be interested in wow, maybe I'll join the military one day and don't do that anymore. So anyway, that if somebody loves the military, that's number one. But do you know anybody? I mean, you guys do because you're here, but where I live and work, my kids are not exposed to anyone in uniform. And I mean, I'm trying to think when they might be. When they have Veterans Day prayer service, that's about it. That's one. And then number two is there's no substitute for good old-fashioned shoe leather. You just have to go where they are. So when I was talking to the Secretary of the Army I was applauding her brutal travel schedule, and I said, yeah, I hear you were just in Houston, you're just in San Francisco, and all she was doing, like I said, was meeting with superintendents and school administrators and teachers and coaches and students themselves to be like, here's why, we're not what you think we are, and this is, don't you want to, And then lastly is the, repeated leadership on appealing to national service, right? Like this is the JFK remarks, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. I do think your generation wants to change the world, to serve. And don't limit yourself into thinking service is, these things. It can also be this. So that's where I would start. But then there's a whole lot of other things, and I've really nerded out on recruiting. Like the military still uses telephone books for recruiting. Yep, that's true statement. Some recruiting, some components of some services, right? So they need a whole lot more modern tools at their disposal and authorities from Congress to they're also working with, basically like the authority they have for like reaching people via television, for example. It's based on like the cable box era when everybody's streaming. There's a whole lot of there's 1,000 things underneath what they could do better and sort of, again, reaching people where they are, whether that's playing video games or sports or whatever. And I've written a lot about that, so check that out. But I loved your question.
Should there be a greater emphasis placed on autonomous weapon systems to offset the shortfalls and challenges in recruiting for military?
HIMARS is looking pretty good.
Yes, but not necessarily for that reason. But yes, I do think the military is going to be forced into this uncrewed or autonomous future faster than they maybe want to be because of the shortfall in manpower and skills. But as long as it's done smartly, that's what I worry about. Is that what I've seen in modern times, last 20 years again, what I've seen assumptions about autonomous systems or sort of remotely crewed, or there's all kinds of variations of autonomy. Is that they often aren't a substitute for manpower, but they are complementary. Now that could change 10 years from now, and I hope it does, where they can actually supplant like an actual job for an actual person. But Congress isn't there yet with like autonomous killer vehicles, right? I mean, I know the CIA has killer drones and DoD helps operate them, but with some small exceptions, for the most part, they're not there yet. But they are there with manned and unmanned teaming, right? So to help with things that don't kill people, like so defensive systems or enabling systems like tanker refueling, an unmanned, fully autonomous flying wingman, right? A bomb truck basically, or but for fuel that has no pilot. Things that help you with just those kinds of capabilities. Yeah, so that's where I would start, and then get everybody more comfortable with then having the conversation about even when I fly here, the pilot's not flying the plane. Let's be honest, till the last 20 minutes. We're already there as a society, but it's really tricky. Congress gets very nervous very quickly about killer weapons that are killer robots, to put it mildly. So, but it will eventually help with some roles and responsibilities for those in uniform. So I don't think they have a choice but to speed it up. I mean, everywhere you look in the Defense Department, there's talk about autonomy. So everybody understands that it's important, but it just hasn't fundamentally changed a lot yet, sort of at scale. There's a lot of good mini projects happening everywhere, but I haven't seen it transform, concepts or training or actual operations yet.
But if I could just jump on that for real quick, if you look at HIMARS, for example, that's a 3-person crew that puts a lot of firepower a long way away. There's no fire direction center. There's no, second crew. It's not autonomous, but it's dramatically less manpower than firepower.
Yeah.
Using technology.
Which is great. Okay, we'll take both of you. Go ahead, and then I'll I'll make sure to get you on your way.
Oh, okay. Well, you're in Austin, and you mentioned that creating new departments is like moving chairs on the deck of the Titanic.
Yeah.
Army Futures Command is here.
Yes.
I wanted to know what your assessment after 3 or 4 years.
Okay. Happy to talk about that. Yes.
A topic I've seen in reviews recently, even in some of the books, is that a couple of these, massive consulting firms are just totally taking advantage and making tons of money doing different DoD consulting projects. And I was curious as far as if you had an opinion on within the defense budget, if that's true, or is the side argument of, well, no, this is money that we're investing back in our economy and jobs and things like that. Just what your
No, I hear you. No, I'm reacting not to your question, but like, as a good conservative, I wouldn't want to spend one defense dollar for jobs. You spend what you need, and if it has the economic benefit, great. I love that. That's a double whammy. But so I cringe at anyone who makes the jobs case for spending defense dollars. It won't get you far very long in DC because right. But you do hear it. So before I get to the Futures Command, right? So Defense Department, largest organization on planet Earth, 3 million people are on the direct payroll. And then the indirect payroll are people who also make a living off of working and providing goods or services to the Defense Department. So they have these 3 workforces, 800,000 federal civilians, just under 2 million people in uniform, active guard and reserve, and then this third workforce, people who build things, make things, write software, or provide services. That third workforce doesn't get a lot of attention, but so the Defense Department's a lot like the American economy today. They spend more dollars that go out the door on services and technology and software than on hardware and equipment. And there's barely any scrutiny. Everybody focuses on equipment, I guess, because you can touch it and kick the tires and that sort of thing, and all of the procurement reform, back to the other question, it's always on the purchase of things, but increasingly hardware is the commodity. That is like a shock to the system, the bureaucracy. So I would love to have more people telling me how many of that third workforce are providing essential services that you don't want somebody in uniform to have to spend that time on, because you want them to do core military tasks that only the military can do. And then, so how many are lawyers? How many are management consultants? How many are contractor, as in contracting? They can help with the writing of contracts. Then I'd love to take a hammer to it, just slash it. Okay, Army Futures Command. Okay, I am being recorded, so I have to be careful. And my joke is I'm like in the Army now in the science board. I'm not a scientist. I know you can tell already. But we're special government employees, and I spend all of my time now, I feel like, working for the Army. So, but I'm a friend to the Army, so I'll always tell them the honest truth, whether it's good or bad. And, I think the Futures Command has had some great successes for what it is. Like I said, I am generally opposed to standing up organizations, particularly ones that don't have we will cease to exist when we've achieved this goal. Inside the department, I think the Joint Staff anyway, there's thinking that it's so successful inside the department that there's talk of a Joint Futures Command. It's a rumor, not happening yet, but possible. But back to my thoughts about it. But so I can point to meaningful doctrine and concept development and actual capability that are coming out of or from or shepherded by the Futures Command, like the Army's IVAS goggles, right? I mean, these are like revolutionary. There's an actual picture of me in them. I can show you wearing them, but they're just astounding. And that was, you couldn't have done what they did for IVAS without a Futures Command, I'd argue. It was like no requirements document. They use special money like other transactional authority. So no Byzantine contracting rules of you got to check all these 80 boxes, and they were able to move fast. They put Microsoft coders in the field next to Army soldiers in real time, and the soldiers were like, that's not how we do it. you know, we play video games like this, so they moved buttons around and updated the software right there. And so like all the things, it was very innovative. I love that. I want more IVASs, basically. But I do worry a little bit about, you know, where it goes from here. So, and I'm talking more here about the balance that's been in the press this week of the 2030 versus 2040 focus.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.